Eli Thorne's truck chewed up the miles like a beast starved for distance, carrying a man whose soul had been sandblasted by the relentless grind of combat. A soldier down to his last thread of resolve. He aimed for nowhere, the road a blurred escape from memories that clung like smoke. Out of the haze, they materialized, three kids rooted to the roadside gravel, barefoot and unbowed, their muted presence a whisper of abandonment louder than any scream. Questions died on his tongue. He simply flung the door ajar. In that wordless pivot, the universe tilted, his story rewritten in the quiet thunder of change. Highway 61 stretched long and empty beneath the August sun, the air around it thick with heat and memory. On both sides of the road, fields lay brown and brittle, stalks of corn bending as if too tired to stand. A single mailbox leaned at the edge of a gravel drive, paint flaking, its flag missing. Eli Thorne sat behind the wheel of his truck, the windows cracked but the air unmoving. The old Ford coughed and sighed beneath him, more rust than metal now, but it still started every morning, which was more than he could say for most things. He hadn't meant to be out here. Not really. The drive started as a way to pick up a replacement fuse for the cabin's generator. Nothing more. But as the tires rolled farther from the tree line in the woods that had wrapped around his home like a blanket of silence, he hadn't turned back. He rarely came this far anymore. Too many things between the road and the trees. Things that looked like people, talked like them too, but asked too many questions he didn't want to answer. And now, stopped at a sun-bleached intersection with nothing around but a rusted-out gas pump and a broken vending machine. He saw it. A sign. It leaned against the side of an old wooden bench. Handwritten in thick black marker on torn cardboard. The words weren't desperate. They weren't clever. They just were. $80 for the boy. $40 each for the other two. At first, he looked away. It was the sort of thing you didn't look at directly. The kind of wrong that felt like it might bite if you got too close. A joke maybe. Some messed up TikTok stunt. Or just some kid playing a dare. Still, he stared. Not directly, but in the way you catch glimpses from the corner of your eye and pretend you're not checking. Three kids. They stood huddled together. Small shadows under the awning of a long-abandoned general store. The eldest boy had his arm around the younger two. Dirt on their skin, shirts clinging with sweat, shoes worn down a thread. The sign leaned in the background like a cruel shrug. He should have left. Rolled the window up. Driven on. Let the silence of the forest take him back. Instead, he stayed. Not because he meant to help. That wasn't his instinct anymore. He'd served enough tours, sat through enough funerals. And maybe that's why he rolled his truck forward a few feet and parked. The engine clicked as it cooled. Heat waves shimmered off the hood. Eli didn't get out. Didn't wave. He just sat there. And then, a sound. Not loud. Not sharp. More like breath. A whisper made of dust and wind. Mr. Eli. He turned. Slowly. Not like someone surprised. But like a man who'd forgotten the sound of his own name and wasn't sure it still belonged to him. The smallest of the three stood just a few steps from his truck. She couldn't have been more than 5. Barefoot. Knees scraped. Hair stuck to her forehead. But it wasn't the way she said his name that hollowed him out from the inside. It was how she looked at him. Not pleading. Not frightened. She looked at him like she'd been told to expect him. Like he was the last square on a board game she'd already played through once before. She didn't smile. Didn't speak again. Just waited. He opened the door, boots hitting gravel with a dull crunch. Still, he didn't say a word. Not yet. Eli had forgotten how to speak first. The other just stared straight through him. No one moved. The kind of stillness that isn't taught but survived into. The kind of stillness kids aren't supposed to know. Eli swallowed once. His throat was dry. Where are you? He stopped himself. The question hung there, half-born and unwanted. He looked at the girl again. She stepped back. He didn't follow. He just turned, walked around to the back of the truck, pulled open the cooler, and set 3 small water bottles on the tailgate. He left the lid open, then returned to the driver's seat. Didn't tell him to take it. Didn't say he'd be back. Didn't say anything at all. Because something inside him, something long buried beneath folded flags and unanswered letters, told him. If they trusted him, it would be in silence. And so he waited. The road ahead stretched on empty. The wind hadn't moved all day. Behind him, footsteps. Not running. Not cautious. Just there. Then, the soft rustle of plastic, the creak of leather seats. The door didn't slam. It clicked. 3 kids. No names. No stories. Just presence. And Eli gripped the steering wheel, not tighter but softer. like it might vanish if he dared to believe it was real. He looked into the rearview mirror once. No one looked back, but all three sat still, water bottles in their laps. Shoes tapping gently against the floorboard. He turned the key. The engine sputtered, then caught. And without another word, Eli Thorne pulled back onto the road. Still alone, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't only his own ghost. There were other shadows in the truck now. Small, quiet ones, and none of them asked where they were going. The miles passed like memory, slow, without sound, without certainty. Eli didn't ask where they were from, and none of the children asked where they were headed. The road offered no signs. Only the occasional broken fence line and sunburnt cattle, their ribs pressing through hide like whispers of hunger. Dust trailed behind the truck like a story they didn't know anyone. Somewhere far off, maybe a state or two away, the war was still happening. One of them. There was always one. But out here, the only war left was the one inside a man too tired to keep pretending he wasn't hollow. The girl sat in the middle of the bench seat in the back. She had her chin tucked down, small hands wrapped around the water bottle, so tightly the plastic crackled with each bump in the road. The older boy, Mason, he'd later learn, sat closest to the window, elbow pressed to the glass, staring out like he was memorizing every tree in case he needed to find his way back. The youngest boy, Jude, was quiet but not still. He tapped one foot slowly, not for nervousness. It was rhythmic, like he was keeping time with something only he could hear. His gaze never left the back of Eli's head. Still no one had spoken. The silence was thick, but not heavy. Not yet. More like something shared, like a blanket between strangers on a cold night. Awkward, but necessary. Eli adjusted the rearview mirror, not to see them clearly, just to confirm they were still there. 3 shadows with breath. That was enough. He turned off the main road eventually. Birch trees lined the gravel now, thin and leaning like old men, their branches brushing the top of the cab. Only the C and the A remained. He didn't slow as they passed. The cabin came into view not long after. A sloping roof of rusted tin, porch sagging slightly to the left, windows gray with dust. Ivy climbed the sidewall, unchecked, a red handprint still faintly visible on the wood panel beside the door. Caleb's doing. Some game with mud years ago. Eli had never scrubbed it off. Gravel shifted beneath his boots as he moved around to the back. Opened the tailgate, reached in and pulled out a single canvas duffel, and the only thing that had stayed packed since he came home. Not because he was ready to go, but because he'd never fully arrived. He walked up the porch, keys jangling lightly against the tin lighter in his pocket, and unlocked the door. The wood groaned. A smell of pine and dust greeted him. It wasn't unpleasant, just lonely. He left the door open. That was all he offered. Behind him, silence again. Then, the soft, nearly imperceptible click of doors opening. 1, 2, 3. The crunch of footsteps on gravel. Not rushed, not timid, just careful. The kind of careful that meant they'd been moved before. Maybe many times. Eli stood inside, back turned, pretending to inspect the hallway light. It hadn't worked since spring. He didn't care, but he needed a reason to not watch them enter. The first to cross the threshold was the girl. She hovered just inside the door, eyes flicking around like a squirrel unsure if it had wandered into a trap. Then Mason followed, holding Jude's wrist. Not too tight, but enough to keep him close. They stood in the doorway like survivors of something unspoken. Eli set the duffel down by the stairs and walked toward the kitchen, footsteps dull against old wood. He opened the cabinet. 3 clean glasses. He filled each with water from the filter tank that barely dripped anymore and carried them to the table. He placed them down, not forcefully, not ceremonially, just enough to make sure each child had one in front of them. The girl sat first. Her knees didn't reach the edge of the chair. Jude climbed up beside her, using both hands to lift the glass, though he didn't drink. Mason stood, one hand on the back of the chair, as if waiting for a cue he never got. Eli didn't join them. He leaned against the frame of the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, watching, not them, but the space around them, the way they occupied it without claiming it. He said finally, "Fresh sheets," in the room to the left. His voice felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. Dry, cracked, as if the words had been buried and dug up again. None of the children moved. No one drank the water. No one asked, "Can we stay?" And Eli didn't ask, "Will you?" Instead, the sound of chairs scraping, quiet footsteps. A door creaked open. He didn't turn around, didn't follow. He just listened. And in that listening, something shifted. Not loudly, not enough to name. A placeholder for whatever would come next. The rain started late, as if it had waited until the world went quiet. It wasn't a hard rain, just a steady whisper against the tin roof, the kind that blurred edges and softened everything it touched. Eli stood by the window of his small bedroom, watching water trail down the pane like fingers tracing memory. The room smelled faintly of pine and old laundry detergent. Dust clung to the corners. He sat on the edge of the bed with both hands resting on his knees, listening. The cabin, even in stillness, wasn't silent. The walls creaked. The old fridge hummed like it had a secret. The wind found its way through the tiniest cracks, humming low against the back door. And above it all, there were new sounds, bare feet on old wood, a muffled cough. The shifting of weight on a mattress not yet familiar. They hadn't spoken, not since they entered the house. That suited Eli. Word could lie, but footsteps couldn't. He stood and walked to the small desk tucked beneath the window. There, tucked into the drawer, was a photograph in a cracked frame. He hadn't looked at it in months, maybe longer, but he didn't forget it was there. He never could. Caleb, 7 years old, standing in the garden with a crooked grin, one sock half on, holding a tin lunchbox like it was treasure. Eli had taken the photo a week before deployment. The last time he'd seen Caleb in person. The image had yellowed slightly at the corners, but the boy's smile stayed the same. Underneath the photo, tucked in a folded napkin, was a note in a child's handwriting. Dad, when you come back, let's go to the big rock near the creek. I'll wait. Love, C. He hadn't gone to the rock. Not when he came back. Not even once. Instead, he built a fence around the memory and locked the gate behind it. And now, 3 children, unnamed and uncertain, lay under his roof. None of them Caleb. And yet something in their silence touched the same place in him he'd long stopped visiting. A soft knock startled him. It wasn't loud, more like the breath of a question. He turned his head slightly. Another knock. Faint. Unsure. He crossed the room, opened the door just enough. Jude stood there, small and still. In his arms, a threadbare blanket bunched at his chest. He didn't speak. His eyes did the asking. Eli stepped aside without a word. The boy didn't enter the room. He just stood in the doorway. The boy began, then stopped. His voice cracked, not from emotion, but from disuse. He looked down at his toes, dirty and curled. Too quiet, Jude said finally. Eli nodded once. Yeah, he answered, voice low. It gets that way out here. Jude hugged the blanket tighter. Can I sit? He asked. Eli stepped aside. The boy moved slowly, as if testing the weight of permission. He sat on the small rug near the foot of the bed. Legs crossed. He didn't look at Eli again, just stared at the window. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The rain carried the silence. Eli sat back down on the edge of the bed. Jude picked at the edge of the blanket, tugging loose a frayed thread. Then, quietly, Annie cries in her sleep, but not loud. Eli didn't respond right away. After a pause, he said, That's all right. Sometimes quiet cries are the loudest. Jude nodded, as if that made sense. Eli let the silence settle again. Then, gently, Where were you all before? Jude didn't answer, didn't flinch, just kept looking out the window. Then, after what felt like a minute stretched thin, lots of places. Another pause. Some were nice. Some had locks. Eli's throat tightened. He didn't push further. He knew the tone of that last word, locks. It didn't need details. Some things were understood best by what went unsaid. Jude stood up quietly, blanket still in hand. He looked at Eli. Thanks, he said, then added, almost as an afterthought, for not asking too much. Eli nodded again. Jude turned to go. Before he disappeared down the hallway, he paused and said, Mason doesn't sleep until everyone else does. He thinks something might happen. Eli nodded. I'll leave the hallway light on, he said. Jude nodded back like it was a pact, then vanished down the dim corridor. Eli stood again and walked to the living room. He found the hallway switch, flicked it once. A weak glow buzzed to life, barely enough to see by, but enough to let someone know they weren't alone. Then he stood there, hands in pockets, staring down the hall. Mason stood just outside the bedroom door, not startled, not moving, just watching. They locked eyes. No words. But Eli felt it, an acknowledgement between soldiers. Different battlefields, maybe, but both had learned the art of staying awake in the dark. Eli turned back to his room, left the door ajar, not fully open, but not closed. That night, the cabin didn't sleep. Not entirely, not all at once. but it breathed for the first time in years, with more than just dust and rain inside its walls. And in the soft space between midnight and morning, 3 children rested in unfamiliar beds. A man sat alone, watching the hallway light flicker, and thought, not of what he had lost, but of what he had let in, just before dawn. The light outside turned the sky a bruised blue, the kind of color that lingers after something is said but not answered. The cabin sat in the hush of early morning, wrapped in mist like a secret it wasn't sure it wanted to keep anymore. Eli stirred in the living room, not because of sound, but because of stillness. He hadn't fallen asleep, so much as leaned too long into fatigue and let it hold him. The old armchair beneath him had lost its shape over the years, but it cradled his spine like it remembered him. For a second, he didn't move. He listened. Nothing. Then there it was. A rustle. A creak. The soft pad of footsteps on wood, unhurried but careful. He kept his eyes half closed and turned his head just slightly toward the hallway. From a sliver between the armchair and the corner wall, he could see the edge of the open door to the kids' room. And in that doorway stood Mason. The boy wasn't headed to the bathroom. He wasn't looking for anything. He was just there, wearing the same too small t-shirt from yesterday, arms folded tight against his chest. He didn't look afraid. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was making sure the house didn't disappear while everyone was sleeping. Eli cleared his throat, quiet, intentional. Mason didn't flinch. He just turned his head slightly, like he already knew Eli would be awake. Then, without a word, the boy walked back to the room. Eli sat up, knees stiff from the angle he'd been sleeping in. He rubbed his palms down his face, then stood and walked toward the hallway. The bedroom door was open just a few inches. He didn't enter. He leaned gently against the doorframe, hands resting in his back pockets. Inside, the scene was still. Jude had cocooned himself into the center of the bed, feet barely peeking out. Annie's blanket had fallen halfway to the floor. Mason was on the far side, now lying back down, one eye still open, watching the door. Eli didn't speak. He stepped in just long enough to pull Annie's blanket up and drape it over her shoulder. She stirred slightly, fingers curling into the fabric, and murmured something incoherent, nothing that needed understanding. He turned to Mason. The boy didn't break eye contact. Eli whispered, "You can sleep." A pause. Then, for Mason, low and even, "Someone has to stay up." The sentence didn't need explanation. Eli nodded once, then stepped back into the hallway. He returned with a flashlight, one of those old aluminum ones that clicked too loudly. He set it down just outside their door and turned it on. The light was steady, small but enough. Without a word, he turned away and left the hallway behind. The kitchen was cold. He didn't light the stove right away. Instead, he sat at the table, elbows on wood worn soft by time, staring at the 4th glass from the night before, still full, a thin rim of condensation clinging to its edges. He took it, poured out slowly into the sink. Let the silence have its moment. Then he turned on the stove. The click-click-click of the igniter was louder than he remembered. The blue flame whooshed up fast. He pulled out the old iron skillet, Caleb's favorite, for making hash and scrambled eggs. It still carried the scent of oil no soap could ever wash out. He cracked 3 eggs into a chip bowl, beat them slow. When he turned around, Luke, he'd learn the name later, was already sitting at the table. Not standing, not wandering in, just sitting, like he'd always been there. He had the same blanket from the night before, now draped over his shoulders like a cloak. He held one end of it with his left hand, but didn't fidget. His right hand rested flat on the table. Eli didn't greet him. Luke didn't ask for food. They just stayed like that for a moment, the air between them warmer than it had been all night. Eli slid the skillet onto the heat, poured in the eggs, listened to the sizzle. "You allergic to anything?" he asked finally, voice hoarse. Luke didn't speak. Eli looked over. The boy shook his head once. That was enough. The smell of cooked eggs filled the kitchen. Eli laid 2 pieces of toast on the old grill rack. No butter left. He made a note to check the pantry later. He placed the first plate in front of Luke. The boy didn't look at it right away. Then, slowly, he picked up the fork and started eating. No pause, no expression, just quiet, steady bites. Not like someone who was hungry, like someone who had learned not to waste the moments when food was offered. A few minutes later, the others arrived. First Jude, then Mason, his eyes scanning the room before stepping fully in. Eli made no announcements, no morning greetings. He just kept filling plates. The children sat, wordless, forks scraping gently against ceramic. For the first time in a long time, The kitchen held a kind of rhythm again. Not joy, not comfort, just a shared act of not leaving. Eli poured himself a cup of coffee, black and lukewarm, and sat across from them. He didn't ask how they'd slept. He didn't need to. Jude reached for more toast without asking. Annie dipped the edge of hers in the eggs before chewing. Mason looked at Eli only once, but long enough for something to pass between them. Not trust, but not suspicion either. A middle ground. The space where people decide whether to try again. Eli leaned back in his chair, the coffee warming his fingers. This wasn't home. Not yet. But it wasn't just a cabin anymore either. It had witnesses now, small ones, quiet ones, and they were watching whether it would hold. The day unfolded without clockwork. There were no schedules, no spoken plans, just light and shadow slipping across old wooden floors. The children lingered near the front porch, never more than a few steps from the cabin. Jude found a stick and dragged lazy trails through the dirt. Annie sat on the bottom stair, legs swinging, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Mason stayed nearest the wall, back pressed to it, arms crossed, watching, always watching. Eli didn't speak unless he had to. He'd never learned how to speak around children the way some men did. Never mastered the gentle cadence, the rising pitch, the storytelling voice. Even with Caleb, it had always been the same, gruff, quiet but present. He spent most of the morning chopping wood behind a shed. The rhythmic thunk of the axe in a pine was grounding. It didn't require thinking, just force and repetition. Each log split clean, gave him a sense of order that life, more often than not, refused to provide. By noon, the clouds had thickened, gathering low over the tree line. The smell of damp moss and metal drifted on the air. Rain again, probably. Back inside, the children had migrated like birds without a leader. Mason perched at the table with a pencil in hand, drawing on the back of an old envelope. Jude sat beneath the window, legs folded beneath him, tracing shapes in the condensation on the glass. Annie had disappeared into the room they now shared. Door left ajar, just enough to hear the soft scuffle of socks against floorboards. Eli didn't ask what Mason was drawing, but he noticed the way the boy hunched over the page, shoulders rigid, hands steady, not sketching for fun, but remembering. The kind of drawing that wasn't invention, but proof. Eventually, Eli approached, mug of coffee in hand. He didn't sit, just stood nearby, glancing over without leaning in. Mason didn't look up. The drawing was crude, in the way a child's sketch often is, but there was precision in the placement. A square room, bars on one side, a figure crouched in a corner, another standing at the door, tall and featureless, and outside the window, a third shape, smaller, watching through broken glass. 3 children, 3 positions, all quiet, all trapped. Mason shaded in the walls with horizontal lines. When he was done, he slid the pencil across the table and looked at Eli, not defiantly, but expectantly, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Eli didn't say anything, didn't ask where, didn't ask who. He just took the paper, folded it once with care, and placed it inside the drawer beneath the phone that hadn't rung in years. That night, long after dinner, which had been little more than reheated beans and bread, they all found themselves in the living room. The rain had come back, heavier this time, tapping the tin roof with impatient fingers. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the cabin felt colder than it should. Jude curled up near the hearth, a blanket around his shoulders like a makeshift tent. Annie clung to a stuffed bear whose ear had half detached, her thumb rubbing the spot absently, as if she could wear downtime by touching it. Mason stood at the far window, arms folded, eyes scanning the dark. Eli was at the kitchen counter, rinsing out a pan, when he heard a sound. Not loud, not sharp, just. He said your name in his sleep. Eli turned. Mason hadn't moved from the window. Eli dried his hands, slowly, then walked over. Who did? His voice was quiet, more gravel than air. Mason shrugged, but it was the kind of shrug that weighed too much. The little one. Jude, he said. He said, Eli, don't leave. The sentence hung in the room like a note held too long. Eli exhaled through his nose. Maybe it was a dream, he offered. Mason nodded. Or maybe he just thought, if he said your name, you'd stay. Eli sat down. Not because he was tired, but because something inside him had shifted out of alignment, and standing suddenly felt dishonest. He looked at the boy. You know my name? He said. Mason finally turned toward him. We all do. A long pause. Then, like an afterthought, they told us to remember it. Eli's throat felt thick. Ooh, Mason's jaw clenched. He shook his head, then looked away. I don't say their names. The wind howled outside, tearing through the trees. The kind of wind that made cabins creak like they were breathing with effort. Eli nodded once. "Fair," he said. He didn't press further. Instead, he stood, pulled the throw blanket from the back of the couch, and handed it to Mason, who didn't take it right away. But eventually, he did. Not as an acceptance, but as an offering returned. Later that night, Eli found himself standing outside the kids' room door. He didn't knock. He just leaned gently against the frame, arms crossed. Inside, he could see them. Jude curled into a ball, Annie sprawled like a starfish, Mason lying on his back, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Eli whispered, more to himself than to them. "I'll be here in the morning." It wasn't a promise, just a fact, something true enough to hold on to, even if no one reached for it. And beyond the thin walls, the rain kept falling soft, steady, as if the sky, too, had something to grieve. Morning came slow, slipping in through the cracks of the wooden cabin like it wasn't sure it belonged. The light had that gray, unsure quality, too early to be warm, too late to be called night. It filtered through the dusty windows and laid across the floor in quiet lines, like chalk outlines of everything that had once gone unsaid in this house. Eli didn't sleep much. He rarely did. Years of being the first to rise and the last to lay down had carved something permanent into his bones. A habit, a defense, maybe both. He moved carefully through the house. Footsteps soft, like someone afraid to wake the past. The floor under the hallway creaked once, an old sound, familiar enough not to feel intrusive. In the kitchen, the coffee pot clicked on with a tired sputter. He let it go, not because he wanted coffee, but because the sound made the place feel lived in. He checked the pantry, half a bag of oats, a dented can of peaches, 3 boxes of pasta, and 1 rusting can of cream corn. Enough to stretch, if he was creative. If not, he'd make a trip into town by week's end. The sound made him pause. Behind him, the door to the kids' room creaked open. He didn't turn, just kept stirring the oats in the pot. Soft footsteps approached. A sock toe bumped the leg of a chair. Then, a quiet shuffle as someone climbed into the seat. Eli poured 2 bowls, one for whoever had joined him, and one he left in the center of the table, just in case. When he turned, he found Jude sitting cross-legged on the chair, hair sticking up on one side, blanket still wrapped around his shoulders like a second skin. His eyes were open but distant, like he hadn't quite landed in the morning yet. Eli placed the bowl down in front of him, didn't say anything. Jude didn't look up, but he picked up the spoon. That was enough. A few minutes passed before Mason appeared, fully dressed, shirt tucked into his pants like it mattered. He didn't sit. He leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "I folded the bed," Mason said flatly. Eli looked up. "In the room," Mason added, nodding toward the back. "Just figured I should." Eli didn't answer, just nodded once and turned back to the pot. It wasn't about the bed. That much was obvious. It was about the ritual, the act of creating something neat in a life that had not been. Mason stepped closer to the table, paused at the empty chair, then slowly sat down. When Annie appeared, hair tangled, one sock missing, she climbed into Eli's lap without hesitation. He stiffened at first, but didn't move. She didn't say good morning. She just rested her cheek on his shoulder and let out a breath. Eli's hand hovered above her back. Then, slowly, without pressure, he let rest there. Not heavy, not light, just present. Later that day, after the dishes were done and the kids had wandered off to the porch to draw with sticks in the dirt, Eli made his way into the room where they slept. He hadn't stepped inside since the night they arrived. 3 beds lined the walls now, mattresses slightly too small, pillows mismatched. The light through the window fell in clean beams across the floor, illuminating dust motes that danced like things long held in suspension. He moved to Mason's bed first, neatly folded, corners tight, no rinques, a precision that didn't belong to children. He ran his hand over the blanket and paused. There was something beneath the pillow. He lifted it gently. A button, small, brown, plain, the kind used on state-issued coats or old uniforms. He picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. The edge was frayed, like it had been pulled free, not slipped off. Then he noticed it. Along the seam of the pillowcase, barely visible, were 3 small, uneven lines scratched in with pencil. A child's handwriting. 3 letters. C-A-L. Ili. Not because of what the letters were, but because of how they were written. That half-finished C, the slight lean in the second L trailing off like the pencil had been pulled mid-stroke. He'd seen it before. On the note Caleb had left him. He stepped back, pulse quickening. This wasn't possible. Couldn't be. The kids didn't know Caleb. He never spoke of him. He never even used the name out loud since the funeral. He turned, suddenly needing air, and opened the window. The wind rushed in cold and sharp. It carried with it a scent of damp earth, pine, and something else, faint metallic. The kind of scent that followed you from a place where names had been forgotten on purpose. As he leaned against the frame, trying to steady his breathing, a sound outside caught his attention. Footsteps, not the kids. He looked out. By the tree line, just beyond the edge of the yard, a figure moved. Not fast, not close, just there, standing, watching. Eli's heart thudded once, deep and echoing. He blinked. The figure was gone. Only mist remained, curling around the base of the trees like a warning whispered through the roots. He stayed at the window for a long time, not moving, just holding the button in his palm. Then, slowly, he closed the window, drew the curtain, and turned back toward the beds. The house felt different now, not in a way he could name. Not yet, but enough for him to know this wasn't coincidence. This was a story that had already started, long before he was ready to be part of it. And now, he was in the middle of it, whether he wanted to be or not. There were places in the cabin where silence had always lived, quiet corners thick with dust, where boards didn't creak and time moved a little slower. The hallway just outside the kids' room was one of them. It had a hush to it, even during daylight, a stillness that made Eli instinctively lower his voice when passing through, though no one had ever taught him to do so. That morning, he lingered in that hallway longer than usual, one hand resting on the wall. The grain of the wood was smooth in some places, splintered in others, like it remembered more than it let on. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Maybe the sound of laughter, maybe footsteps running toward him. But the house remained still, the kind of still that came not from emptiness, but from caution, like the walls were listening. Annie was the first to speak to him that day. Not with words, exactly, but something close. He was out back, sorting through a box of old tools beneath the overhang, trying to find something to fix the cracked porch step. She wandered over, barefoot, curls tangled from sleep, holding a drawing in her hand. She didn't say look or hear. She just stood beside him and raised the paper up to his side, eyes forward. Eli turned. The drawing was done in pencil, faint lines, unsure strokes. It was a house, their house, or close to it. There were trees drawn around it, and a sun in the corner, its rays uneven like fingers reaching out. But what caught his eye were the four figures out front. One tall, three small. They were holding hands, but the tall one, him, wasn't looking at the others. He was turned away, face not drawn, just a blank circle where eyes and mouth should have been. Annie's thumb pressed into the edge of the page, smudging the pencil slightly. Her other hand picked at the hem of her shirt. Eli didn't ask her to explain, didn't kneel down or say things like that's nice. He just took the drawing, careful not to fold it, and said, "You're good with shadows." Annie didn't smile, but she didn't walk away either. And when he went back to the toolbox, she stayed there beside him, humming something under her breath that didn't have a melody, just a rhythm, like her own private metronome. By midday, the air grew heavy again, the kind of pressure that made doors swell and windows stick. Rain had a way of returning to this place like it had nowhere else to go. The kids gathered in the living room without being called. Jude found the chest set on the shelf and tried to piece it together, mismatching black and white pawns like it did matter. Mason read from a dog-eared book with no cover, eyes skimming but not stopping. Annie curled beneath the quilt, eyes closed but not sleeping. Eli sat in the old rocker by the fireplace. He didn't rock, just held a screwdriver loosely in his palm, the weight of it grounding. His eyes moved from child to child, measuring the room not by how quiet it was, but by how unguarded it had become. They weren't relaxed, but they weren't braced either. That was something. When the rain finally began, it came not with violence, but with surrender, a slow, steady percussion on the roof. Eli stood, walked to the window, and watched the world turn gray. That's when he saw it. A small pair of boots, mud-caked, frayed, set by the door. Not lined up neatly, just dropped there, as if their owner had begun to believe they didn't need to run anymore. He stared at them longer than he meant to. In another life, Caleb had boots like that. Different size, same wear. And for the first time in years, Eli let himself remember not the funeral, not the folded flag, not the silence of the drive home from the base, but a smaller memory. One from before. A morning just like this, with rain and Caleb, 6 years old, grinning, trying to step in every puddle on purpose just to make his father laugh. And he had laughed. Not loud, but enough. Eli blinked hard. The boots blurred, then sharpened again. Behind him, a chair scraped across the floor. Mason. He stood at the table, holding something. A frame. Wooden. Plain. Inside it, an old photograph. Of Eli in uniform. Younger. Face unlined. Eyes squinting at the sun. And next to him a boy. Caleb. Grinning. Mason set the photo on the table like a question he wasn't asking. Eli walked over, slowly. Mason didn't look at him. Just said, "Found it in the drawer." His voice was flat, but his fingers trembled slightly. Eli picked up the frame. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, he used to build traps in the woods. For rabbits. Never caught a damn thing. But he always checked them. Every morning. Mason looked at him. Eli set the frame down. "He was a lot like you," he added, almost like an afterthought. It wasn't praise. Just recognition. Mason said nothing, but he didn't walk away. He stood there, beside Eli, the rain softening outside, as if even the sky had started to listen. That night, Eli opened the drawer again. He took out the drawing from Annie, the sketch from Mason, and the photo of Caleb. He didn't organize them. He just set them on the table, side by side, and then he turned off the light. Left them there, as if the house, too, needed a chance to remember. Some nights pass like water, slipping through fingers without resistance. Others gather in the corners of a room, heavy and unmoving, like a presence no one wants to name. That night was the second kind. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air carried the memory of it. Wet earth, soaked leaves, and something faintly electric. Thunder had come and gone hours ago, leaving behind a hush so deep it felt unnatural. Inside, the cabin exhaled slowly. Wood cracked and settled. Pipes groaned. And from the far end of the hallway came the muffled rustle of shifting sheets and the soft sound of breath. Not quite steady, not quite restless. Eli sat on the front steps. A blanket draped over his shoulders, not because of the cold, but because it reminded him of something softer than his own skin. His boots were off, his feet bare, pressed flat against the wooden porch, worn smooth from years of weather and waiting. He held a small object in his hand, the button, brown, threadbare, still warm from being carried in his pocket all day. He turned it over with his thumb, again and again, as if hoping for some change, some sign. Behind him, the door creaked. He didn't turn. A pause. Then the sound of light footsteps, almost hesitant. Mason sat down beside him. Not close. Not far. The silence between them wasn't awkward. Just honest. The kind that comes when words have been used up. After a long while, Mason spoke. "He always look at you like that. Eli, Glenn. Who? Your son. Caleb." The name hit the air like a dropped glass. No one had spoken it aloud in years. Eli took his time answering. Not always. Not when he was mad. Mason smirked. "Barely. I get that." They sat for a while longer. The sky had cleared just enough to reveal a handful of stars. Muted, blurred by low clouds, like memories seen through tears. "I don't pray much," Mason said. Eli didn't respond. "But last night," Mason paused, then tried again. "Last night, I asked someone something that we could just stay here a while longer." Eli looked over. "You think that's what praying is?" he asked. Mason shrugged. "I didn't know what else to call it." Eli nodded. "That's close enough." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded paper from days ago, the one with the drawing, the walls, the barred window, the figures. He placed it beside the button on the step. "I don't need you to tell me what this means," he said, "but I'm not throwing it away." Mason said nothing, just looked at the paper, then at the sky. The next morning, Jude was gone. Not missing, just not inside. Eli found him by the woodpile. Curled up in the old canvas hammock Caleb had once hung between two birch trees. The fabric sagged with age, but it held. Jude was awake, eyes open, hands gripping the edges like the whole world might tilt if he let go. Eli didn't speak. He just sat on the stump nearby, a few feet away. Birds chirped in the canopy above. Sunlight filtered through branches in thin, gold ribbons. The ground was still wet, but the promise of warmth hung in the air. After some time, Jude sat up. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, then looked at Eli, not with fear, not quite with trust. Something in between. "What's your real name?" Jude asked. Eli blinked. It was the first full sentence Jude had spoken since arriving. He thought for a moment, then answered, "Eli Shepherd." Jude repeated it under his breath. Once, twice, letting it settle. That's a strong name, he said finally. Eli smiled, not with his mouth, but with something older. You think so? Jude nodded. Sounds like someone who doesn't leave. The sentence landed like a nail through wood. Eli didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. Instead, he stood, reached out his hand, not toward Jude's arm, not his shoulder, but open, palm up, an offer, not an order. Jude stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, he placed his own small hand in Eli's. They didn't go inside right away. They just stood there. Two people, one beginning. That afternoon, Annie brought out the box of chalk she'd found in the drawer beneath the sink. Most of the pieces were broken, colors worn to nubs. Still, she passed them out carefully, blue to Mason, yellow to Jude, pink for herself. They drew on the porch. Not pictures, just lines, shapes, circles within circles. Mason made a square, then drew a smaller square inside it. Then another, then another. Jude traced the outline of his hand again and again until the wood was a patchwork of fingers. Annie drew a sun in the corner, like she'd done in her sketch, but this time the rays stretched outward, touching the others. Eli watched from the doorway, arms crossed, leaning against the frame. He didn't speak, didn't correct them when chalk dust smeared or when someone drew over another's mark. He just let it happen, because some prayers don't need words. Some homes don't need to be built. They just need to be held. The first knock on the door wasn't loud. It came in the late afternoon, right when the house was still holding onto the heat of day. And the kids were napping in separate corners of the porch. Jude curled like a question mark near the swing. Annie splayed out with chalk-streaked fingers on the steps. And Mason with a book half open on his chest, pretending not to sleep. The knock came again, this time a little sharper. Not urgent, just persistent. Like whoever stood outside wasn't in a hurry, but wouldn't leave either. Eli wiped his hands on a cloth, dusted with flour from the kitchen. He'd been trying to make cornbread, but the mix kept clumping. Something about the altitude, or maybe he just didn't care enough to get it right. He opened the door. The man standing there wasn't what he expected. Barefoot, mid-50s, maybe older, weathered in a way that didn't come from age alone. He wore a coat too heavy for the season and a hat that looked like it had seen more states than most people. His eyes, pale blue and sunken, held no threat, just weariness. You Eli Shepherd? The man asked. Eli didn't answer right away. Depends, he finally said. The man nodded, like that was fair. I'm looking for someone, he said. Name's Lucy. About this tall. He held his hand about 4 feet off the ground. Brown eyes, little scar above the lip. Used to wear a red jacket with flowers on the back. Eli stared at him. There's no one like that here. The man squinted, not in suspicion, just sadness. I figured, he said quietly. But folks in town said maybe. Thought I'd try. He turned like he was ready to leave, but Eli spoke again. You're a father? The man stopped, shoulders tight. I was, he said. Maybe still am. Depends who you ask. A long pause settled between them. You got kids? The man asked, glancing past the doorway. Not the kind you're looking for. The man nodded slowly. Well, if she shows up. He reached in his coat, pulled out a photograph, creased, faded. A little girl in overalls, standing in a field of wildflowers, squinting at the sun like it dared her to look away. He handed it to Eli. I ain't got a phone, he said. But I come through every week or so. Truck stops down the road. Folks know me. Eli took the photo, held it carefully. What happened? Lumen sighed. Same thing that happens to everyone. I left. World kept moving. And then he was gone. No goodbye. No name. Just the soft thud of bare feet on gravel, fading down the road. Eli stood there for a long while. Photo in one hand. Silence in the other. He didn't go back to the cornbread. Instead, he stepped outside and sat on the porch between Jude and Annie, who stirred a little but didn't wake. He looked out at the trees. The wind moved through them like breath, bending branches in slow rhythm. He thought of all the people still out there, looking, wandering, waiting, fathers without names, daughters without jackets. He thought of Lucy, whoever she was. He thought of the photograph in his pocket, curling at the edges like it wanted to fold into something smaller, something easier to lose. And then he heard it. Not a voice, not a footstep, just the sound of someone breathing behind him. He turned. Mason, standing in the doorway, arms crossed. You knew him? Mason asked. No. He looked like someone you used to be. Ili Dlinket. Maybe. Mason came out and sat on the step, closer than usual. After a long silence, he said, You ever wish someone came looking for you? The question wasn't soft. It wasn't brave, either. It just was Eli didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed Mason the photo. Mason looked at it for a long time. "Why'd he give you this?" he asked. "Because I answered the door." That night, after the kids had eaten and gone to bed, Jude with his blanket tight, Annie curled against her pillow with her hand in a fist, and Mason pretending not to watch them both, Eli sat at the kitchen table. The photograph lay flat before him. Beside it, a half-finished drawing. Annie's. It wasn't a house this time. It was a road. Curved. Unending. Disappearing into trees. And in the middle of it, 3 small figures holding hands. No tall figure this time. Just them. Alone. Together. Eli traced the curve of the road with his finger, then folded the drawing, placed it in the drawer beside the others, and turned off the light. But he didn't go to sleep. He stood by the window for hours, watching the road, as if it might answer something he hadn't yet asked. In the kitchen drawer, beneath a stack of frayed napkins and rubber bands that had long lost their stretch, Eli kept a $10. It wasn't locked, wasn't hidden, but the kids hadn't touched it. Not because they were told not to, but because some things carried a kind of quiet weight, the way a Bible might in a soldier's duffel. You didn't need rules to stay away, just a sense of something sacred. That morning, before the sun had found its way past the tree line, Eli opened it. Inside were names, dozens of them, scrawled on napkins, receipts, cigarette cartons, bits of cardboard from ration boxes. Some were full names, others just initials, all written in the same hand, his. Names of boys he'd served with, names of kids he'd met while stationed overseas, names of locals who brought food to their post, names of enemies who died staring up at the same sky as him. He didn't read them often, just unfolded each scrap like he was checking on something long buried. Mason stood behind him in the doorway, arms folded across his chest. He didn't ask what the names meant. Didn't have to. The cabin filled with a strange kind of noise that only children can make when they're not trying to be heard. Soft laughter under their breath, footsteps like skipped beats on the floorboards. Jude was trying to fix the leg of the porch swing. He worked with a screwdriver too large for his hand, tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth. Mason painted with mud and water along the wall, shapes that made no sense to anyone but him. Annie was planting something, not seeds, just pebbles, lining them up along the edge of the yard like soldiers in a parade only she could see. "What?" Eli asked, kneeling beside her. She didn't answer at first, just pressed another pebble into place. Then, "If I plant them and they stay, it means we stay." He looked at her for a long time. "You think that's how it works?" Annie shrugged. "Used to." That evening, a letter arrived. Not by post, just tucked under a rock near the fence. No envelope, just a folded page, the edges stained with coffee or rain. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside, "Heard you've been keeping 3. Not all of us think that's wrong. Some of us remember what it means to be carried. Keep going." No signature, no name, no return address. Eli read it twice, then burned it in the fireplace. Not out of fear, but because some words are meant to live only long enough to be believed. Later that night, Mason sat across from him at the table, a chessboard between them. Pieces mismatched. Some carved from wood, others bottle caps or coins. No rules, just movement. Eli moved a pawn forward. Mason countered. No words passed between them for several turns. Then Mason said, "Are we still temporary?" Eli didn't respond right away. He moved a knight, took a bishop. Mason stared at the board. "I don't want to be temporary anymore," he said. Eli looked up. The boy's eyes were steady, not defiant, not pleading, just still. "I'm not good at forever," Eli said finally. "You don't have to be." Mason moved his rook. Check. They sat in silence again, but it wasn't hollow. It held something, like 2 walls learning how to lean on each other without collapsing. Later that night, long after the lights were out and the kids had drifted into the kind of sleep where their faces finally looked young again, Eli returned to the drawer. He opened the tin, like it had passed through too many empty barns and broken fences. It carried dust, and with it, the scent of something faintly metallic, old tools maybe, or rusted memory. Eli was on the roof patching shingles when he saw the car. Too clean for the road it traveled. It slowed near the end of the drive, but didn't turn in. Just idled. A dark figure inside. Then, after a minute or so, it rolled forward and disappeared behind a bend. He stayed up there long after the car was gone, hammer resting beside him, one boot heel hooked under the gutter for balance. From that height, he could see all the way to the tree line, where the woods began to thicken, where no fence had ever been built. The kids were in the yard below. Mason had rigged a kite from newspaper and twine. Annie ran beside him, too small to help but trying. Jude was near the fire pit, stacking stones in an uneven spiral. His small hands worked slowly, precisely. The wind lifted the kite. It rose awkwardly, lurching left, then up again. It didn't matter that it wasn't steady. It was airborne. That was enough. Eli climbed down, hands raw and knees stiff, and walked back inside. On the kitchen table, he spread out an old manila folder. It was thick with paperwork, bills, discharge forms, yellowed custody notices, and a letter from the VA stamped deferred. He pulled the paperclip off and let everything fall into a loose pile. Then, slowly, deliberately, he began sorting through them. Some he burned. Some he folded into quarters and placed in the bottom drawer. But one form, creased and coffee-stained, he read 3 times. Petition for temporary guardianship. There was a blank space for the children's full names. Another for the guardians. No weaknesses. No notari. Just a form. Eli set it down. He didn't fill it out. Didn't even pick up a pen. He just let it sit there, absorbing the light from the window, like paper did when it was trying to become something more than what it was. That evening, Mason found a stray dog by the fence. Not a puppy. Not tame. Just ribs and fur and a limp that suggested it had outrun something worse than hunger. He didn't try to pet it. Just knelt in the grass, arm out, palm flat. The dog didn't move. Neither did Mason. They stayed like that for nearly 10 minutes. Watching, breathing, coexisting. Then the dog turned and slipped back into the woods. Mason didn't say a word about it when he came back inside. But later, as they cleared the table, he told Eli it looked like it had been loved once. Eli nodded. So do you, he said. Mason didn't answer, but his hands moved slower after that, as if carrying something invisible. Night came early. The sky clouded thick, and the wind pressed hard against the house, testing its seams. The kids slept closer together than usual. Eli sat by the wood stove, the guardianship paper on the floor beside him. The corners had begun to curl from the heat. He didn't touch it. Didn't move. He just stared at the fire. Some things burn clean. Others leave a smell behind. He couldn't decide which kind this would be. Hours later, Annie woke crying. Not loud, just small. Broken sounds like something in her chest had cracked. Eli found her sitting on the hallway floor, knees to her chest, the old quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't flinch when he approached. Didn't speak. He didn't ask what the dream was. Didn't say it was going to be okay. He just sat beside her, back against the wall, knees bent, arms resting loosely on his thighs. Eventually, she leaned into him. Not all at once. Just a little weight. Then more. Her head pressed against his side. A hand crept out from the blanket and found his. She didn't grip it. Didn't hold tight. Just touched. Like an anchor. Like a question. And he answered. Not with words, not with promises, but by staying. The next morning, before the sun had warmed the window glass, Eli returned to the table. He opened the drawer, took out the guardianship form, and, with a hand steadier than he expected, wrote, Child 1, Mason Taylor. Child 2, Annie Lee. Child 3, Jude Campbell. Then, under guardian, he wrote, Ili Schickert. He didn't sign it. Not yet. Just folded it once. Placed it inside the tin box, on top of the names that came before. Because paper wasn't strong enough. But maybe names were. Maybe staying was. Sunday brought cold light. The kind that filtered through the trees like memory. Pale, uncertain, soft on the skin but sharp in the heart. The ground was still wet from the night rain. Drops clung to every branch like tiny truths refusing to fall. Eli stood at the edge of the yard, watching the kids build something with old crates and rope. It's a jail, Annie said, unprompted. Voice light, but just for frogs. Jude nodded seriously. We let them go after 5 minutes. Mason didn't join in. He sat apart, carving thin notches into a length of driftwood. The handle of a pocket knife moving slowly in his palm. It was a ritual now, quiet time. The others made noise. He made marks. Eli let the scene unfold. Didn't step in. Didn't praise. Didn't correct. Just watched. Like he was learning a language he'd once known but forgotten. How laughter sounded when it wasn't forced. How stillness could be safe. At midday, the mail truck came. It never stopped at the cabin. Not officially. But sometimes when the wind blew right and the driver remembered, they'd find a letter or a box tucked behind the gatepost. Today, it brought a package. Wrapped in butcher paper, string-tied with a farmer's knot. No return name. No address. Just E. Shepherd scrawled in thick ink. Inside, 3 books. one on birds of the Midwest, one on wood carving for beginners, and a thin paperback with a faded cover, How to Legally Adopt Without a Lawyer. Eli didn't react, didn't sit, didn't call the kids in, just walked to the back of the house, to the small shed where the mower and tools lived, and placed the books on a high shelf. Out of reach, not out of mind. That night, around the dinner table, something shifted. No announcement, no big gesture, just a word. Annie passed him the potatoes and said, "Here you go, Dad." It slipped out like breath. No emphasis, no apology. The others froze. Eli's hand paused midair. She didn't notice. She was already reaching for another fork. Mason stared at his plate. Jude blinked, then continued eating. But something had changed. Not in the room. Inside him. The word landed heavy. Not like a hammer, but like rain on old wood. Not painful. Juste permanent. Later, when the plates were rinsed and the stove cooled, Mason lingered in the kitchen. He didn't look up as he spoke. "You okay with that?" he asked. With what? Because it did. And that, more than anything, scared him. That night, in the small bedroom with its sagging floorboards and quilts worn soft at the edges, he took out the paper again. The form. He stared at the name he'd written beside Guardian. Eli Shippeth. Below it, a blank line for a signature. He could hear the wind shift outside, the sighing of the trees, the clink of something left on the porch. He reached for the pen, but didn't sign. Not yet. He folded the paper again, held it for a long moment, then slid it beneath his mattress. Not to hide, but to feel the weight of it under him as he slept, like a vow made with the body instead of the hand. In the morning, the kids woke early. Too early for school, too late for dreams. A bird, one wing longer than the other, beak chipped, the surface uneven, but on the bottom, carved with deep, deliberate lines, were 4 letters. D-I-D. Eli turned in his hand. It was heavy, not from the wood, but from the shape of what it tried to say. He didn't speak, just nodded, held the carving in his palm, like it might fly if he loosened his grip, then placed it on the windowsill, where the light hit it just right, where the wind wouldn't knock it over, where it could stay. The letter came on Thursday. Official seal, government ink, the kind of envelope that made a man's stomach twist before he even slid it open. It sat on the table all morning. No one touched it, not even Mason, who usually couldn't stand unopened mail. By noon, it had become a presence in the room. Eli finally opened it while the kids were outside, Annie chasing a butterfly with a red plastic cup, Jude stacking stones again. Mason lying in the grass, pretending not to watch them both. Inside the envelope, a letter from the county. A visitation notice. Someone had come forward, claimed to be a relative of Annie. The paper was formal cold. It didn't ask for feelings. It stated facts. There would be a meeting, a temporary pause to assess the living situation. Assess, as if the warmth of Annie's laughter. Watched Jude turn toward him when he scraped his knee and didn't cry, just came close and waited for the hand on his back. Watched Annie fall asleep on the porch swing, her hand gripping the hem of his shirt even in dreams. Watched Mason leave the back door open, trusting the world not to come in and hurt them anymore. He watched and said nothing, because sometimes love was not in the saying, but in the not saying, in the waiting, in the guarding of a moment that might never come again. That evening, Eli sat on the porch steps with a mug gone cold in his hands. The old radio played a station too far to come and clean, just whispers and wind and the occasional banjo lost in static. He remembered the last time he'd felt this kind of weight. It wasn't overseas. It wasn't in the noise of war. It was in the silence after, standing in a hallway too clean, too quiet, waiting for a doctor to say words that would make his boy's name past tense. That same ache had returned now. Not as sharp, but deeper, more spread out, like a cold under the ribs that never left. When he finally told the kids, it was Jude who spoke first. "Is someone coming to take Annie?" No one looked at her. Not even her. She sat still, holding her spoon midair. Cereal soggy and forgotten. Eli didn't lie. "I don't know yet." Mason pushed his chair back hard. The legs scraped loud across the floor. "That's not an answer. It's the truth. Truth should mean something." Mason muttered, storming out. The door banged behind him. Silence followed. Then Annie whispered, "Will you come with me?" Eli turned. "To where?" "To wherever they take me." She didn't ask for promises. Didn't beg to stay. She just asked for company. The kind that made leaving hurt less. Eli reached across the table and took her hand. "Anywhere," he said, and meant it. That night, he sat with Mason on the roof. a blanket wrapped around both their shoulders. The stars blurred a little from the wind or the eyes. Hard to tell. "You mad?" Eli asked. Mason shrugged. "I'm tired." "Of what?" "Of not knowing where I belong." Eli nodded, then pointed. "You see that star? That one barely blinking?" "Yeah, that's us." "Wobbly?" "Still there." Mason didn't speak again, but he leaned into Eli's side, the way boys sometimes do when they forget they're growing up. And they sat like that until the cold made their bones ache. Until the sky turned gray. Until it felt like maybe, just maybe, their little light would hold. The visitation was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. A county building out by the highway. Crouched and yawning, Eli dressed the kids in the best they had. Mason in a blue-collared shirt 2 sizes too big. Jude in a sweater with a moth-bitten sleeve. Annie wore her red boots, the ones she only put on when she was afraid. "They make me run fast," she'd once said. But she didn't run that day. Not once. The car ride was quiet. Mason stared out the window, lips pressed tight. Jude held Eli's hand the whole way, fingers small and certain. Annie kept her eyes on the sky, counting clouds out loud, under her breath, like they were prayers. Eli drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the gear shift, knuckles pale. His eyes stayed forward. The world passed in silence. Cornfields, fence posts, rusted mailboxes, all leaning just a little. The waiting room had green chairs, not the soft kind, the kind you had to sit in carefully, as if they might crack or betray you. The social worker was late. The other family wasn't. The woman who claimed to be Annie's aunt sat across from them. She wore perfume too heavy for morning. Her lipstick was neat, unbothered. She didn't look at Annie. Not really. She looked through her, like checking to see if she still matched the photograph, if she was still something she could claim. Annie shifted in her seat, red boots tapping a soft rhythm. Jude fidgeted with the string on his hoodie. Mason watched the door. Eli didn't move. Were there any legal arrangements? What schooling had they received? Did he understand this was temporary? In the unspirit. Slow. Measured. Like walking across thin ice. Annie stood by Eli's side, unmoving. He knelt. You okay? She nodded, then shook her head. Do I have to go? No one said anything yet. But if they do? Eli looked her in the eye. I go with you. She leaned into him, not as a child into a parent, but as something softer, like breath into lungs, like weight into hands. Then she whispered, I want to stay where I remember my name. Back at the cabin, the sky had darkened. A storm coming. Mason chopped kindling without being asked. Jude fed the fire carefully. Annie sat on the floor, drawing shapes in the dust with her finger. Eli watched them, not like a guardian, not like a soldier, but like a man afraid he might wake up tomorrow to silence. He stepped outside into the cold. The wind pulled at his shirt. He looked up at the sky and, for the first time in a long time, prayed. Not for miracles, not even for keeping, just for clarity, for the strength to sign his name and mean it. The rain came heavy that night, not gentle, not slow. It hammered the roof like a warning, like someone knocking to remind them that borrowed time always comes due. Eli sat alone in the kitchen, a single bulb overhead buzzing soft, casting his shadow onto the cupboard door. The adoption form lay flat on the table now, no longer folded, no longer hidden. His name was still there in block letters. The signature line below it, still empty. The pen lay nearby, unused. He stared at it for what might have been an hour, or longer. Time had become water, rushing, pulling, refusing to hold shape. In the next room, Mason stirred in his sleep. Not a nightmare, just the kind of restless turning that meant he wasn't sure if he was allowed to rest yet. Jude whispered to himself in dreams, soft consonants tumbling like marbles across wood. Annie was quiet. She'd taken to sleeping with her boots beside the bed. Not on her feet, just close enough to grab if someone came knocking again. They all slept differently now, closer to the door, closer to him. Eli picked up the pen. It felt heavier than a weapon. More dangerous, too, because what he was about to write couldn't be undone by apology or time. It wasn't just about keeping the kids. It was about what he had to promise. That he would stay, that he wouldn't walk, that he wouldn't flinch when things got hard, when memories clawed back in, when Annie cried without sound, when Jude closed himself off, when Mason, tall and silent, tested every edge of trust like a fence needing mending. He'd been a soldier. He'd followed orders. He signed a paper. No flourish. No hesitation. Just his name, steady and plain. Eli Shepherd. It didn't make a sound, but something in the house shifted, just a bit. A beam groaned overhead. The fire in the stove cracked. Outside, the rain slowed like it had been waiting. The next morning, the road was all puddles and steam. The kids didn't know what he'd done yet, but they moved differently. Jude asked to help with the dishes. Annie sat on his lap after breakfast, unprompted, tracing circles on the back of his hand with her thumb. Mason offered to chop more wood, even though the stack by the shed was already enough. When he turned to leave, they didn't ask where he was going. They just nodded, because trust, once broken, returns slowly like sun after storm. But when it does, it brings warmth into the cracks. At the county building, Eli handed the form to the clerk behind the thick glass window. She barely looked at him, stamped it, filed it away. Next, that was it. No ceremony, no handshake. No one clapped. But when he walked out the door and felt the late morning light on his face, something inside him opened, like a window stuck too long in winter. And for the first time in years, he let himself breathe in all the way. He didn't take the highway home. He took the long road, through pine stands, past dry creeks, past mailboxes leaned over like they were tired of waiting for letters that never came. He stopped at a roadside stand and bought apples no one needed, just to thank the woman for being there. He waved at a boy on a bike and meant it. He parked the truck outside the cabin and didn't rush inside. Just stood for a minute, watching. The smoke from the chimney curled upward. Boot prints marked the mud near the porch. Children's laughter echoed, faint behind the door. He stood there and thought. This is what coming home should have felt like the first time. Not silence, not guilt, not ghosts, but warmth. A name spoken out loud. And someone waiting behind the door, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That evening, the sky didn't put on a show. No sunset bleeding orange across the trees. No birds cutting patterns into the dusk. Just a slow dimming, like someone easing the world into sleep with a gentle hand. Inside the cabin, the kids moved around the living room like they'd lived there forever. Jude sat with a comic book, mouthing the dialogue to himself, tracing the pictures with one small finger. Mason strung twine between two nails on the wall and hung their drawings, lopsided animals, a few wobbly houses, Annie's version of their front porch with everyone standing in it, including Eli. She'd drawn him with a big hand on her shoulder. The smile didn't quite reach his eyes. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, humming something tuneless, twisting an old button on a string like a talisman. No one said the word adoption. No one mentioned papers or judges or bloodlines. They didn't need to, because Eli had walked in, closed the door, and didn't leave again. And sometimes, presence says more than any promise. The days that followed passed like breath. Small, essential. They went to town together once a week for groceries. Jude liked the canned peaches aisle. Mason always stopped to touch the hardware tools, running his fingers across the wrenches like he could feel the weight of fixing things. Annie collected brochures from the bulletin board by the entrance, flyers for music lessons, dog training, church suppers. She couldn't read all of them yet, but she liked holding them. Eli didn't say much during those trips. He drove with the window cracked, elbow resting on the frame, country radio low. He'd glance at them in the rearview mirror sometimes, not to check, just to remind himself, they're still here. One night, the power went out. No warning, just a click and a silence, so thick it startled them all. Jude dropped the spoon. Mason looked up from his book. Annie went still. Then, slowly, Eli lit a candle. The glow was soft, orange, unsteady. He pulled the old quilt from the back of the couch and spread it across the living room floor. The kids followed without being asked. They didn't need a reason. Just warmth. Just together. Annie crawled into his lap, her cheek against his chest. Jude curled at his side, thumb near his lip, but not quite in it. Mason sat across from him, candlelight flickering in his eyes, face unreadable. You ever scared of the dark? Mason asked after a while. Eli didn't answer right away. He thought about foxholes and flashbangs, about nights where dark meant danger and days were worse. Then he said, only when I was alone. Mason nodded, didn't ask more, because some answers come with silence trailing behind them, thicker than words, harder to hold. The power returned in the middle of the night, but no one moved. They stayed curled together on the floor like animals in a den, breathing steady, unbroken. In the days that followed, small things started to shift. Mason asked to learn how to drive the truck around the yard. Jude showed Eli a sketch of a dog he wanted to get when we're safe. Annie began calling the cabin home without flinching. Eli found himself cooking more grilled cheese, potato soup, toast with cinnamon sugar. He whistled sometimes. Not a tune, just sound, something to fill the space. The memory of the visitation faded. But not entirely. Some days, Annie still woke with the boots in her hands. Some days, Mason looked toward the road too long. Jude kept a small bag under his bed, just in case. But the fear no longer owned them. It just lingered, like old wallpaper, still there, but painted over. And Eli, he didn't try to erase it. He just stayed, in the quiet, in the doing, in the long stretches of nothing that children fill with questions and soldiers fill with breath. One morning, Annie gave him a bracelet made of thread. It didn't fit. It broke when he tried to slip it over his wrist. She looked horrified. He picked it up carefully, tied the ends together, and looped it through the strap of his watch. Now it holds time, he said. She smiled, and for the first time, it did reach her eyes. That night, after the kids had gone to bed and the fire had gone low, Eli sat at the kitchen table and opened the drawer. Inside, the tin box. He took it out, opened it. Inside were the names. Still folded, still quiet. He added one more slip of paper. Didn't write a name, just one word. Ours. Then closed the lid and let the silence stay. But this time it didn't feel empty. This time it felt whole. The frost came early that year. It crept along the windows before dawn, painting pale veins that caught the morning light like the inside of a snow globe. The grass stiffened beneath its touch. The porch steps turned slick. Eli rose before the others, as usual. His boots whispered across the floorboards, careful not to wake the creaks. He moved through the kitchen by memory, coffee, stove, kettle, the same quiet rhythm of a man who used to wake to mortars and now woke to the sound of his own breath. Steam rose from his mug. He didn't drink it right away. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, watching the tree lean. That road, the one curling away into the woods, had once been a question. Now, it felt like punctuation, the kind that comes at the end of something whole. They left at midday, not because they had to, not because anyone was chasing them, but because the cabin had given them everything it could. It had held them in silence. It had let them become a family, but it was never meant to be a forever place. There was no mailbox with their name, no rooms that fit the boys' growing limbs, no neighbors who would ask about school plays or offer casseroles when flu season came. They needed something else now, not bigger, just shared. They packed light. Annie carried her red boots in her lap. She'd outgrown them, but refused to leave them behind. Jude clutched a rolled-up drawing of a dog, worn at the corners. Mason rode in the front seat, knees pressed against the glove box, one hand out the window like he was memorizing the wind. Ili drove, one arm resting on the wheel, the other across time itself. They didn't speak much, didn't need to. Every bump in the road, every curve through the trees, was a goodbye said without words. They passed familiar places. The gas station where Annie once asked what premium meant. The diner with the rusted sign, where Jude spilled a whole cup of chocolate milk and didn't cry. The old church with a broken bell tower, where Mason sat in the back pew once and whispered, "Maybe I believe in something again." Each place held a thread, small and frayed. But Eli didn't look back. He kept his eyes forward. By dusk, they reached the outskirts of a small town, the kind with only one grocery store and a post office that closed early. A "For Rent" sign leaned in the window of a white house with chipped paint and a wraparound porch. The front yard was mostly dirt and dandelions, but it faced west, so the light lingered there just a little longer. Eli parked the truck. No one moved. Then Jude said, "This one feels quiet." Annie nodded, but not the sad kind. Mason didn't speak, but he was already reaching for the door handle. The landlord was an older woman named Mrs. Daw. She didn't ask many questions, just looked at the kids, then at Eli, then at the truck, and said, "You look like you don't leave things half done." Eli signed the lease with the same pen he'd used on the adoption form. Same hand, same weight. That night, they unpacked slowly. Mason claimed the room with the crooked window. Jude picked the one with the view of the oak tree. Annie chose the smallest room, but only if she could have the closet for her drawings. Eli slept on the couch, said it was better for his back. No one believed him, but no one argued either, because beginnings don't always come with ceremony. Sometimes they arrive like a whisper, like the soft click of a lock turning, like the stretch of a back after too long curled in fear. In the weeks that followed, the house changed shape, not physically, but through the lives that filled it. Boots by the door, Crayon on the wall, carefully scrubbed. A chipped mug that only Mason used. A jar of coins labeled, maybe dog. The faint smell of toast always in the air. One evening, as the last light slipped through the blinds, Eli stood on the porch with his mug. Same steam. Different place. He looked down the road. The one they'd come in on. And for the first time in a long, long while, he didn't wonder where it led. Because he wasn't chasing peace anymore. He was making it. One morning at a time. One small kindness after another. One child who now slept without flinching. And that, somehow, was enough. Autumn came like an old song. Soft, familiar, a little frayed at the edges. The kind you didn't hum so much as carry inside your coat pocket. Leaves crisped into color, then fell in slow, spiraling silence. The backyard filled with them. The porch steps, too. Annie loved to rake. Not for neatness, but because she liked making piles to jump into. Jude followed behind her with a paper bag, stuffing it with acorns and sticks that looked like letters. Mason raked without being asked, each stroke steady, deliberate, like he was trying to gather something he couldn't name. Eli watched them from a porch, mug in hand, flannel pulled close. He hadn't told them yet about the letters from the county. The official envelopes. The forms marked finalized. The new birth certificates with his name beside theirs. He wanted to wait, not because he was afraid, but because something about waiting made it feel sacred. Like the moment had to breathe first. The house had settled around them. Walls no longer echoed. The floor creaked in places that now felt known. The kitchen had a drawer full of tangled cords and bottle caps. The fridge bore their lives in magnets and drawings and crooked shopping lists. Annie's note in marker still clung to the freezer door. Do not eat Jude's last pudding. He will cry. Jude hadn't cried in weeks. He laughed now. Real belly laughs. Especially when Annie sang songs she made up on the spot. Strange little tunes about toast or spiders or why dogs don't wear hats. Mason had stopped sleeping with a baseball bat under his bed. He still checked the locks at night, but he didn't linger there. Not anymore. One morning, the doorbell rang. It startled all of them. No one had used it yet. Eli opened the door to a small man in a brown uniform, holding a clipboard and a package. Delivery for Shepherd. The man looked at Eli, then at the three kids now clustered in the hallway behind him. Looks like y'all are settled. Eli just nodded. Yep, we are. The package was light. Just a cardboard box marked fragile. Inside, a wooden sign, hand-carved. Simple. It read, The Shepherds. Oe. This year. The kids stared at it like it was a map to something they'd almost stopped believing in. Did you order this? Jude asked. No, Eli said. And then, quietly, but maybe someone thought we'd earned it. They hung the sign on the front porch. Not over the door, but beside it. Just high enough that Annie had to stretch on tiptoes to touch it. Which she did. Often. Mason ran a thumb over the carved letters, like checking if they were permanent. Jude stood back and smiled like he'd built the whole thing himself. That night, they made spaghetti. It burned a little. No one cared. They ate it on the floor in a circle, with paper towels for napkins and the radio playing low. Eli didn't say much. He just looked at them. These three not quite strangers, not quite as by blood, and felt something settle. Not pride. Not ownership. Just rightness. Like an ache that had found its rhythm. Later, when the kids were in bed, he stepped out onto the porch again. The air smelled like wood smoke and dried leaves. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. A train rumbled through the edge of town. The sign caught the porch light just enough to glow a little. He touched it once, then turned toward the door. Inside, Annie had left her boots by the mat. Jude's sketchbook lay open on the coffee table. Half a dog drawn, nose still missing. Mason's hoodie hung from the stair rail, sleeves twisted together. He picked it up, folded it, placed it on the step, and for no reason at all, he smiled. The road still waited out front, unmoving, always offering somewhere else. But Eli didn't look at it that night, not even once. It started with barking, not loud, not frantic, just a low, hoarse sound, like a cough made of gravel, coming from beyond the back fence. Eli heard it first while chopping wood. The axe paused midair. He listened, waited. There it was again. 3 short barks, then silence. He lowered the axe, wiped his palms on his jeans, and looked out toward the tree line. Mason saw it next. He was the one who spotted the rustle in the brush, the cautious movement near the old woodpile. Not a deer, not a raccoon. Too slow for either. He didn't call out, just crouched, arms on his knees, watching. The dog stepped into view like it didn't trust its own legs. Matted fur, one ear half torn, ribs like bent branches under a too thin coat. It didn't whimper. It didn't beg. It just looked at Mason, then at the house, then back toward the woods. Jude was the one who broke the stillness. He came out with toast in his hand, planning to feed the birds. Saw Mason. Saw the dog. Didn't speak, either. Just walked over, tore a piece of toast, and dropped it gently in the grass. The dog didn't move. Think he's scared? Jude whispered. Mason shrugged. Think he's watching if we're worth it. They sat there for a long time. Minutes. Maybe an hour. No one rushed. Eventually, the dog crept forward, each step like testing the world again. It ate the toast, then lay down. Still not close, but not leaving. That night, Annie gave up her extra blanket. She folded it, placed it just under the porch steps, and whispered, for him. Eli didn't stop her. Didn't say it was a stray. Didn't say they couldn't. He just nodded. Sometimes, kindness is quieter than rules. The dog stayed. Not inside. Not yet. But close enough. Each morning, he'd be there on the porch, tail thumping once when the door opened. He followed the kids to the edge of the yard. Waited while they walked to the school bus. Sat there until they returned. Annie named him Button. Because he holds things together, she said. Eli didn't correct her. Button had scars. Mason noticed them one afternoon while brushing out the tangles behind his ears. Someone hurt him, Mason said softly. Eli watched from the doorway. Yeah, he said, then added. But he came back anyway. Mason didn't say anything else. He just kept brushing. Slow. Gentle. They made a spot for Button near the fireplace. Not a bed. Exactly, just an old rug, a bowl of water, a pair of Jude's socks he'd donated without being asked. At first, Button stood by the doorway, uncertain. One paw over the threshold, ears flat. But that night, during a cold snap, he crossed the line, curled himself on the rug, sighed once, and slept. Eli stayed up late that night, watching the fire fade. The kids had long gone to bed. Button shifted in his sleep, whined once, then stilled again. Eli thought about all the nights he'd slept like that, half alert, half guarding, waiting for footsteps that never came. Now here he was, watching a dog do the same. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes. The next morning, Button was still there, still breathing, still home. And when the kids came down the stairs, Anne found him stretched across the rug. Annie whispered, see? He knew. Eli didn't ask what. Some things don't need spelling out. They're just true in the way that breath is. Later that week, Jude taped a piece of paper to the fridge. Family rules. We don't yell. We wait for each other. No one eats alone. Button is ours. If someone is scared, you stay. Eli read it once. Then once again. He didn't add anything. Just left a pen beside it, in case someone else needed to. That evening, the porch light buzzed to life as the sky turned lavender. Eli stood beside Button, both of them watching the last bus of the day roll past. The world, somehow, had tilted, just enough to make space. Four kids, if you counted the dog. And one man who'd stopped expecting anything more from the road. The air smelled like leaves and wood smoke. Button leaned against his leg. Eli reached down, scratched behind his ear, and said, almost to no one, you did all right, old boy. Then turned toward the house, and let the door fall shut behind him. Soft, like it always belonged. The first snow came in the middle of the night. Not a storm, just a hush. Like the sky had exhaled and the world was too tired to fight back. By morning, the backyard was blanketed in white. Fence posts were little caps. The old tire swing Jude never used looked like a question mark frozen mid-thought. Even the porch, always dusty, now gleamed beneath a thin crust of untouched snow. Eli stepped outside before dawn. Coffee steamed in his hand. The air was sharp, clean, almost holy. He didn't speak, just stood barefoot on the cold wood, letting the quiet do its work. Inside, Button stirred, then padded softly to the door, his breath fogging the glass. It would be their first Christmas together. The first anything together, really. They didn't talk much about holidays. Too many old stories hanging in the corners. Too many questions that didn't have gentle answers. But one night, over beans and cornbread, Annie looked up from her plate and asked, do we do Christmas? Jude stopped chewing. Mason glanced at Eli. Button, under the table, raised his head like he too was waiting. Eli nodded, slow. Yeah, he said. We do now. They didn't have a tree. Not at first. So Jude drew one on butcher paper and taped it to the wall. Annie cut out stars from cereal boxes. Mason found twine in the garage and strung bottle caps across the fireplace. Eli brought in an old milk crate from the shed and told them it was for wishes. Write what you want, he said, or what you miss. No one asked what he meant. They just wrote. Folded paper. Dropped them in. Even Button. Jude made one for him that said, to not be alone when it thunders. The town square lit up by mid-December. Strings of yellow bulbs hung between telephone poles. Plastic wreaths on lampposts. A rusted Santa leaned crookedly beside the post office. They walked through it one evening, bundled in hand-me-down coats. Annie's scarf was too long, dragging behind her like a story she couldn't let go of. Jude stopped to look at the fake snow in the shop windows. Mason lingered by a man selling roasted nuts. Eli watched them all from behind. Not quite walking ahead, not quite falling behind. Just there, keeping time. Christmas morning came without surprise. No tree with blinking lights. No stockings. No roos. But the house was warm. They opened the milk crate. One by one. Jude's wish was for a book with real maps. Mason said, to not mess this up. Annie didn't read hers aloud. She just held it close and nodded. Eli's slip was blank. He'd forgotten to write anything. Or maybe he hadn't known what to ask. Maybe, for the first time, he didn't need to. After breakfast, they took Button out to the field. Jude tossed sticks. Annie tried to catch snowflakes on her tongue. Mason, ever watchful, built a lopsided fort, guarding the others like a habit he couldn't break. Eli stood back, then slowly stepped in, picked up a stick, threw it. Button chased it. And for once, they all laughed at the same time. A clean, full sound. Not because it was funny, but because it felt right. Like breathing after a long swim. That night, they sat by the fire. No music, no words, just crackling wood and soft breathing. Annie leaned against Eli's arm. Jude rested his head on Button's side. Mason stretched out on the rug. Eyes half closed. Eli didn't move. Didn't blink too much. He didn't want to scare the moment off. Because this quiet, imperfect, fiercely tender moment was what he didn't know he'd been fighting for all along. Not medals. Not parades. Just this. A night without running. A house with names on every room. A dog snoring by the fire. And kids who now reached for him in the dark. Not to be saved, but simply to be held. Outside, the snow kept falling. Slow. Certain. Covering the tracks they once left behind. Spring did not arrive like a miracle. It crept in, unsure. A little mud first. Then bird song in the distance, soft. Like someone learning a tune they'd half forgotten. The snow melted without ceremony. Just disappeared one day, like fear after a long conversation. And with it came other things. Letters in the mailbox again. A knock at the door that wasn't the wind. Footsteps on the gravel road. The outside world was returning. Not as an enemy. Not entirely as a friend, but as something that would need to be faced. And Eli knew the stillness couldn't last forever. The first letter came from a cousin, someone who hadn't written in 15 years. Short, formal, full of words that circled around guilt without landing on it. The second came from the state. An invitation to a hearing. A request to verify, clarify, confirm. Not an accusation, but not kindness either. Just protocol. And with it a reminder that healing doesn't mean hiding. That peace, if it was to last, would need roots deep enough to stand against wind. Eli sat on the porch with the envelope in his lap. He didn't open it for hours. Inside, the kids were painting the walls. Annie's idea. Spring colors, she said, which meant soft greens, watery blues, fingerprints everywhere. Button had stepped into a tray of paint and walked across the floor. No one cleaned it up. Jude said it was art. Mason said it was a map. Eli didn't argue. Some messes were meant to stay. That evening, he finally told them. About the hearing. About the fact that the state, though it had accepted the papers, stamped the names, still wanted to observe the home. No threats. No timelines. Just observation. Still, the words sat heavy. Like waiting for a storm that might not come. The kids didn't say much. Jude asked if they had to move again. Eli shook his head. No one's taking you, he said. And though he meant it, the way his voice caught made Jude's eyes widen. Mason didn't ask anything. He just stood, walked to the window, and stared out, hands in his pockets like his father might have done once. Annie sat down beside Eli, took the letter from his hand, didn't read it. She just folded it carefully and placed it under the lamp, then climbed into his lap. I don't care what they say, she whispered. This is my place. The day of the visit came 2 weeks later. Sunlight, clear and honest, poured through the windows. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and dust. Button barked once, then quieted. The woman from estate wore soft shoes and a wool coat. Her voice was polite, measured, the kind of voice trained not to spook horses or children. She walked slowly through the house, took notes, asked a few questions. Annie showed her the paint mural. Jude showed her where the dog slept. Mason didn't show anything, but he stood at Eli's side, silent and tall. "Do you feel safe here?" she asked, not looking at anyone in particular. No one answered right away. Then Jude, from the hallway, called out, "We lock the doors at night." There was a pause. Then laughter. Real, unexpected. Even a woman smiled. "Sound about right," she said. She stayed 35 minutes. Left a card on the table. Said someone would follow up. Maybe. Probably not. Then she was gone. Like a ghost with manners. That night they sat outside. Button at Eli's feet. Annie curled in his coat. Jude lying flat on the porch, counting stars that hadn't come yet. Mason lit a small fire in the yard pit. He didn't speak. Just watched the flame hold its shape. "You think she liked us?" Annie asked. Eli didn't lie. "I think she saw us." Annie nodded. That was enough. Later, after they all went inside, Eli stayed back. He picked up one of Button's toys. A knotted rope, frayed at both ends. Carried it to the porch edge. Let it dangle. The stars had come out. Soft, scattered. Not trying to impress anyone. He looked at the house. Lights spilling from windows. Laughter faint behind walls. Not perfect, but real. Not loud, but strong. And in that moment, Eli didn't feel like a soldier. Or a stranger. Or someone trying to fix the past. He just felt like a man who stayed. And for the first time in years. That was enough. By the end of May, the garden had taken over the side yard. Tomatoes in crooked rows. Peas along a wire fence Eli had hammered together one Sunday afternoon with Mason. Annie called it our jungle. Jude said it looked like a map. Green paths, twists. A place where things grew even if no one asked them to. Eli didn't argue. Some things grew because they were meant to. Others because no one told them not to. Inside, the house had changed too. The dent in the hallway was still there, where Jude had thrown a ball too hard that first week. The floors creaked louder now. Not because they were older, but because they were walked on more. Lived in. Rooms had voices. The kitchen laughed. The bathroom door groaned when shut too fast, and someone had carved a name into the wooden banister on the stairs. It wasn't a perfect name. Misspelled. Uneven. But it was a name. It belonged to them. One morning, Mason came downstairs early. Earlier than usual. He stood in the kitchen, staring at Eli like he was rehearsing something. Then he opened the drawer, pulled out the envelope with the old army check that had never been cashed. He laid it on the table. "I want to help fix the roof." Eli looked up. The boy was taller now. Maybe just a half inch, but it showed in how he stood, shoulders straighter, jaw set. "You don't have to do that," Eli said quietly. "I know." And that was all. Later that week, Eli and Mason went into town. Hardware store. Nails, tar, and new ladder. Jude came too, picked out a doormat with a faded sun on it. Annie chose lavender seeds. No one said anything about the past. No one tried to define what they were. It wasn't necessary anymore. The mail came on a Friday. One envelope this time. For the county again. Eli didn't hesitate. He tore it open standing by the sink. Just a few lines. The adoption had been finalized. No more check-ins. No more follow-ups. No more visits. Just names. Official now. Jude's. Mason's. Annie's. His. No celebración. No confetti. Just the wind blowing through the screen door. And a silence that felt like peace, not absence. That evening, he grilled hot dogs on a rusted little stove. Button circled the porch, tongue lolling, tail wagging like a lazy metronome. Annie spilled mustard on her dress. Jude asked if they could camp outside that night. Mason didn't ask anything, but when Eli passed him a plate, he nodded just once, and that was its own kind of prayer. They ate together in the backyard, under a sky more lavender than blue. The field behind the house buzzed with summer's promise. Crickets, birds, something unseen shifting in the tall grass. After dinner, they lay in the yard, one by one, until it looked like someone had spilled a family across the lawn. Jude pointed at a blinking star. "Do you think someone's watching us?" Annie whispered, "Only if they're lucky." Eli didn't speak, just looked at them, then at the house behind them. Crooked porch, paint peeling on a south wall, a roof that still needed fixing. But in the window, the light glowed gold. And on the fence, someone had hung a wooden sign, carved rough. Home, not fancy, just real. That night, as the kids dozed off in their sleeping bags under the open sky, Eli stayed awake. Button pressed against his leg, the stars overhead. He thought about the first day, the roadside, the silence, the dust in his throat. He thought about the way Jude had flinched at raised voices, the way Mason had watched everything like it might disappear, the way Annie had held her breath like life was something she had to ask permission for. And now, they breathed, laughed, fought, slammed doors, apologized, lived. He didn't feel like a savior. Didn't feel like a soldier anymore either. Just a man sitting in the dark, grateful that something had broken open instead of breaking apart. Grateful for the mess, for the second chances, for the house they'd built. Not with blueprints, not with rules, but with days stacked on days, moments held quietly, and the kind of love that doesn't need ceremony. Only presence. The wind shifted. A single lavender bloom beside him trembled, then held still again. He lay back, arms behind his head, closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long, long while, he didn't feel alone. Some stories don't end. They just settle, like dust on old floorboards, like breath softening after a long walk home. This one began on the side of a road, with a man too tired to hope and 3 kids too small to ask for it. It didn't need saving. It just needed time, and someone willing to stay. Not all wounds bleed. Some are quiet. Some are shaped like empty rooms, untouched chairs, a name never spoken aloud again. But sometimes, when you build slowly enough, with silence and burnt toast, and muddy footprints across the hallway, something takes root. Not perfection, not happily ever after, just a house full of names, and a man who stopped running. If this story touched something quiet in you, maybe a memory, maybe a question, maybe just a feeling you haven't found the words for yet, leave a trace below. Tell us about the porch you once sat on, or the day you chose to stay, or the person who taught you that healing doesn't always shout, because stories like this don't end with credits. They continue in the people who carry them. Maybe you're one of them, and if you are, thank you for listening this far. That, too, is an act of staying.